Thanks a lot for the introduction, and thanks a lot for the invitation to Ornella and the other organizers. I'm very pleased to be part of this exciting Italian adventure into psychedelics. I read the instructions wrong and thought I had 30 minutes, so this is just heads up that there will be flashing images of slides that I'm going to sprint through. I didn't have the opportunity to take them out, so I will have to try to skip over some of it during the talk, and I have a kind of a strategy for which one to go quicker through. So similar to Kim, I've been involved in the psychedelic research for now 20 years, not as long as Rick, who has been really for many years involved in the space, but we have been in it for a long time, and we're part of launching the center at Imperial a few years back together with David Nutt and Robert Card Harris. So basically, we already saw this mathematical model of how the brain functional networks appear. So I've just made a slide to explain it a bit. So basically, the different colors represent different functional brain networks, and the different circles are different brain regions, and the lines are connections between. And what happens through brain maturation from childhood to adulthood is that these form more and more and more. They become more separated from each other, the different networks, and they form the connections within the networks, both anatomically and functionally. So that is part of making the brain function in a more efficient, more energy-saving way. So that is part of normal brain maturation. So the first part of the talk, which I will go very quickly through, is sort of basic neuroscience and how the brain matures, and then I will go into the psychedelics. So this is basically just a slide to show you that it's not something I came up with, but there's data from brain development to support this, that this is how these networks mature. So you can either talk about the networks becoming more sophisticated, more tuned within the networks, and more separated from the other networks. And you can do other kind of measurements of it and talk about the brain being more and more modular, more and more separated in different modules during brain maturation. Another thing, again, basic neuroscience, one of the dominant themes or ways of understanding how the brain works and how mental health conditions evolve and work or don't work is through prediction error model. So basically I won't go into details about brain prediction error model, but it is the reason why, I don't know if people can see what the color is on the can there. Does somebody want to shout a color on the can? It looks red, and the thing is there's no red on this slide. It's all without any red, and that's because we fill in the gaps. So basically our brain is sort of sometimes cheating us by having these inner models of how the brain works, and then apply that in a top-down fashion onto what comes in through our senses. And that might also be part of the reason why the hype of psychedelics is building, because we also fill out the gaps into sometimes not always deeply strong evidence, and then we just want it to work, and therefore sometimes we can also have our prediction error going a bit wrong in a way feeding into the hype of psychedelics, but that's another story. This is another example of a visual illusion that works because of this top-down control, the prediction error. In a way, this is also in order for the brain to function in an energy-saving and efficient way, so we don't need to make total sense and interpret everything in detail coming in. We have a top-down way of testing it up against pre-existing model that have developed through our experience, or via experience. We know that alpha, one of the things we can measure frequencies with EEG, is related to the top-down control of these models. And the reason why I mention that is that you'll see some data relating back to that. Again, in order to keep the brain efficient. Because our brain is out of the safety of our mother's womb for a long time, more than other mammals, because we keep on maturing outside the womb, and from childhood to adulthood there's a lot of things that need to be sophisticated at a young newborn child compared to other mammals. It's completely useless and hopeless because the brain is not fully matured yet. A lot of things can factor in and influence and make some of that go wrong through negative impacts from gene and environment, and then make some of that go wrong, and in a way, instead of making this nice and soft moldable clay into a beautiful pot, it can come with cracks through this maladaptive maturation of the brain, including the top-down models and including the way that the brain networks function. So one of the themes that I have decided to focus a bit on in this talk is that we can, I say, one of the common denominators that goes across mental health could be something at being stuck in thinking or behavioral patterns in a maladaptive way. So one different features related to stuckness I have put on this slide. So I won't go through them at all in detail, just put them up on the slide. So some of them are very clearly directly related to stuckness, pre-contemplation. I don't know if this might be something else. Pre-contemplation, which is sort of being not ready to engage in a transformative sort of change space for treatment. That you're sort of stuck in this ambivalence about even being ready and motivated for change. Rumination is also a very classic stuckness feature, but all of these different features, I would argue, is related to being stuck in thinking or behavioral patterns, and are related to mental health. Some of them very specifically to some conditions, some of them broadly across conditions like experiential avoidance, but some of them sort of maybe featuring more in some mental health conditions than others, and there could be put more stuckness on, and there could be more conditions on this slide. When we as psychiatrists, as I'm a psychiatrist, and when we are supposed to come up with what is the most important thing to treat in a person suffering, in this case for depression, we are in a way, again maybe in a top-down model kind of thing, our priors are that this will be the features that are listed in the core criteria that in a way we have ourselves defined, how we define depression, diagnostic criteria, core symptoms. We want to get rid of that on behalf of the patient, right? We want to get rid of negative feelings, depressed mood, and anhedonia, for instance, because they are the core features of depression. However, if you ask a patient, they are prioritizing what they would like changed in a different way. They would like the addition of things, addition of joy and meaningfulness. That they will prioritize higher than getting rid of the core features of depression. And that already is a paradox and an important thing to be quite aware of, I think, as a treating clinician. But it also speaks to what I will come to in a moment, the psychedelics. So basically, could we maybe break some of this stuckness to take the clay pot with the cracks back in time and make it more moldable and soft again, and then maybe reshape it and remold it? And for that, the psychedelics are interesting. They have already, and this is where I'm being saved a bit by Dr. Piomarta from earlier today, and also the person explaining the personal experiences, so I won't go into this detail of this slide. I have just listed what I think as the main thing, that if I explain it to a participant in a trial, what is altered state of consciousness, what is a psychedelic experience, I would go through the things over to the right-hand side. And when it comes to the main risks and so on, I would go through some of the stuff on the left. And I won't go into detail with it. You probably all know all of it already, but I will put emphasis on this because I think we might be under-informing, under-consenting a little bit to these features that have to do with that inner psychedelic experience. There might be autobiographical stuff, which is real early memory, for instance, that you might not have recalled before. That can happen. But it can also be dreamlike, more symbolic representation of different psychological material that might not be real, but might be a symbolic form like a dream. But it might feel more real than reality, and that can be tricky, in particular if it's early abuse material that comes up, has happened also in our trials, and therefore this opens up to issues about hidden false memory that I don't think you should mention when you consent a person, but I think you should mention those in blue specifically without going into too much detail. I think it's important for the preparation and the consenting of people going into psychedelics. As we have heard, it's not just about giving people the drug, it's about a full context of setting, music, the room that you are using, and of course, very importantly, the people present in the process, the guides, the therapists, the clinicians in the room, and also in the preparation and integration phase. and the music, as I mentioned. This is me trying to come with some examples of how most psychedelic trials are being designed and are being conducted. So the simplest version is to do some preparation, then give people a psychedelic, and do some integration, and then have some measures before and after. That means it's a single arm, it's a within subject testing before and after, there's no control condition, and there's no randomization into two different arms of the trial, for instance. Then it can, and that is done in quite a lot, including our very first depression trial was designed like that. That was the first depression trial in the sort of new era of psychedelic science. This is a design that is a little bit more sophisticated, where still a single arm, still within subject comparison, but we have preparation, but then we come in with a placebo session, then some integration, and then the real full dose psychedelic session, and then some more integration. And that means we can then compare what happens from before to after the placebo session to from before to after the full dose session. There's no, it has strengths and weaknesses, and we have used that design in several of our studies that I will show you some data from if I get to it. And then you can do a more sophisticated design, which is more expensive, and you need double many participants, and you can randomize into two arms where you have them separate. Then you will have people be disappointed going in the placebo arm, and then you might do a crossover that makes it even more complex. So that's a different way of doing it. In order to try and understand what is happening in the brain, we can use different tools. We can use molecular imaging like PET or SPECT. We can use structural and functional like MRI, and electrophysiological measures like EEG and MEG. And if we start a bit with some of the MRI stuff, we are back here in the functional networks. That comes from our first psilocybin trial with imaging. I think the first ever imaging study, no, maybe not, acutely on psilocybin years back. And this is then the model of the networks. And what happens, as you already know, on a psychedelic acutely is this. So a disintegration of this of the networks, they become less separated. They start communicating across. So that is one example of what we can use with the MRI. We have recently published a review on a lot of imaging findings from the psychedelic science. And if we look at the other version of this, the other way of looking at functional connectivity in MRI, we can talk about modularity. That's kind of a rough global functional connectivity measure. And when we look at that, we can see that there's a decrease in the modularity from pre to post treatment with psilocybin in people with depression, in two separate trials with depression, and we do not see that decrease pre to post with SSRIs in our randomized trials where we compared. We can also see that in healthy people who are naive, they've never tried a psychedelic before, this is not published yet, we can see that this change in modularity is directly related to their increase in well-being. So again, it looks like two separate depression data sets and one healthy psychedelic naive shows a relationship between improvements and change and reduction in modularity. We also have DTI findings that is coming out in the same paper very soon that is suggesting that there might be structural changes after a single dose in psychedelic naive healthies, and that might be related to some of the other measures that I won't go into now. We can also assess the brain's responsivity to emotional states or emotional phases, and we can see that where the SSRIs, they put a bit of a dampener on the response of the brain to different emotional states, the psychedelics don't. So again, possibly a different mechanism. The psychedelics do not sort of put this sort of lid on to your emotional responsivity, whereas the SSRIs do. We can also use PET. I will skip this. There's a preliminary data suggesting low 2A binding related to more mystical experience, and we are currently looking in with sort of methods with PET into molecular plasticity, to density of synapses we can measure with PET, and we are looking into that with ketamine and DMT and others with psilocybin, and it's ongoing work. With EEG, one of the things that we can look at is entropy, complexity of the brain. It was also mentioned by Dr. Persipia earlier today, and we can actually see something quite interesting with this data. Again, not published yet. We can see that the degree of that complexity in the acute state. So here we have an objective brain measure rather than a scale like mystical type experience questionnaire, something like that. We have an objective measure of the complexity of the brain state acutely under psychedelic, being directly related to later increase in well-being, and also the insight gained from the psychedelic experience measured on the day after the experience. We can also measure plasticity paradigms with EEG, and we are applying that in all our trials, and there are some effects after ketamine in humans. Otherwise, a lot of the plasticity story with psychedelics is very, very much in the lab in preclinical studies, but we are trying with all these methods to get a better grab on it in terms of in humans. Back to this slide with the Stockness. So now I showed what psychedelics are doing, thank you, in the brain. And this is then some of the impacts that is having on something that is more exciting than something we can quantify on a brain scan. These things that are directly impactful and related to people suffering in different mental health conditions. These different sort of takes on being stuck. And what we can see is that some of them we are currently investigating, so are others, so we don't know yet that much. It could be that we can rebroaden a hijack reward spectrum in people with addiction, and we can measure that by doing cue reactivity tasking, and we are looking into that in addictions, gambling and opiate use disorder at Imperial. We are launching new studies. So those are things we are interested in having more objective brain measures of, but we can also see all these different data coming from psychedelic science studies, including a lot of them from our own lab, that there are changes after psychedelics. And if you look at the ones that sit in this cloud, they are kind of almost a bit anti-blunting. So where SSRIs sometimes create blunting, and people with depression already in kind of a blunted, flattening, anhedonic state, we can see that the psychedelics almost have an anti-blunting kind of effect. I think this is important because if we, which I will, go to the more, what you normally would present, as was done also by Professor Amin in the previous talk, is like, what is the clinical data, right? That's the most logical, and that's what clinicians want to look at. It is what pharma companies want to look at, is what your primary measures in trials. But what I just showed you before, those are not the primary measures, but they are quite important for the people suffering. Now I will take you briefly through some of the clinical main outcomes, which is depression severity. If we are talking about psychedelic treatments for depression, then obviously we need to also look at the actual measures of depression. And I'll just summarize that on this slide. So these are some of the largest trials. Psilocybin for depression, the two, Usona and the Compass one, and then you have one DMT, small pharma together with us at Imperial, for depression as well, so a short psychedelic experience with DMT. They all show nice efficacy, good safety, and also quite sustained effect. Very similar across trials. Also our own trial, where we compared with SSRI, shows very similar. I won't go into details. Clearly. But I put this to summarize that overall the depression trials with psychedelics look maybe 2 to 3 times in terms of efficacy compared to conventional talking and pharmacotherapies for depression. So that's good at this point. There are several things we need to understand better. We need to understand more about the role of therapy. We need to understand more about the role of the setting, what are predictors, and I have some slides on that if I don't have time for it. So, OCD, I'll just give you a teaser. We have done an OCD study. I think Luca Pellegrini might be here, and also Naomi Feinberg involved as collaborators onto the trial together with the team at Imperial, done a pilot in OCD, and the preliminary results are coming here. Basically showing that there seemed to be an effect. This was a 10 milligram dose. There seemed to be a decent, small, on the core symptoms of OCD as well. So now we have depression, OCD. It needs to be replicated and done in the larger trials with different doses. What about eating disorder? We have also unpublished data now on anorexia nervosa with psilocybin treatment. Again, both trials here, single arm, placebo, and then full dose. And what we see here is that the core symptoms of anorexia are improving. We also can see that at 3 months after the intervention, so the 3 months follow-up. And we can see that pre-contemplation, this sort of unreadiness or motivation, pre-contemplation is the opposite, not being ready. We can see that the pre-contemplation goes down, so people become more ready for change, more ready and motivated for treatment. Addictions, we already heard it in the previous talk, so I've just put a review paper on that we recently published, where we have reviewed some of this literature, and then I'll clearly stop. I'll stop here. Oh, do I have 1 minute more? No, I don't. I'll stop here. Yeah, this is very exciting otherwise, but yeah. No, it's my own screw up. I thought it was 30 minutes. My fault. Conclusion? There's no conclusion. It looks promising and fine. We can see that the psychedelic experience seems to be predictive, but it's not causal. We have a new study where we have interfered the experience and can see that actually it looks like if we interfere, it's published with DMT, if we interfere the experience, we are taking some of the magic away, which is interesting and a little bit more causal comment onto the psychedelics. And otherwise, I don't have any particular conclusions. I'll stop here. Thank you.